أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد المرسلين خاتم النبيين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين عباد الله أوصيكم وإياي بتقوى الله وطاعته وأحذركم وإياي عن عصيانه تعالى ومخالفة أمره. يقول الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم: من عمل صالحا فلنفسه ومن أساء فعليها وما ربك بظلم للعبيد. We begin, my dear brothers and sisters, by sitting quietly and emptying our hearts and minds from all of the thoughts and the emotions that course through them, distracting us from feeling the presence of Allah more keenly within our own beings. And in this state of inner quiescence, we then bear witness that there is no God but God, the One, the Almighty, creator of the heavens and the earth, and light of the heavens and the earth, the all-merciful, the all-compassionate, who created as an act of mercy and compassion. I will complete this testimony by bearing witness that our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is indeed his beloved servant and messenger, whom Allah sent to be the final messenger to humankind, to teach humankind how to live a life that was pleasing to God. We invoke Allah's blessings, His peace, His barakat, and His salams upon the soul of this noble Prophet and messenger, upon those of his companions who bore witness to him and who waged the struggle with him to ensure that God's faith would exist, would continue, would survive, and even thrive. We also invoke Allah's blessings upon the members of his noble family, who also waged the effort with him and suffered as he suffered during the course of his message. My dear brothers and sisters, Allah has said in his noble book that whoever of you does good has done it for his own sake, to his own benefit, and whoever of you commits a wrong has only wronged himself, for your Lord is not unjust to his servants. My dear brothers and sisters, alhamdulillah, by sunset today, we will have fasted 26 days of this blessed month of Ramadan. In addition to fasting, many of us have performed Taraweeh prayers, and some of us have completed one or more full recitations of the Quran, or will have done so within the next 4 days. As we approach this final few days of Ramadan, we just have like 4 days left of fasting, not counting today. Many of us feel prompted by the Prophet's hadith to look for Laylatul Qadr in these last few days, especially on the odd nights. The Prophet asked us to look for it in the eve of the odd days, the eve of the 21st, the 23rd, the 25th, the 27th, or the 29th. And tonight is the eve of the 27th of Ramadan, the day when many Muslims all over the world celebrate Laylatul Qadr, and I'm sure many of you also will be doing so. One way of looking at this is that this is our last chance to squeeze or extract out of this month whatever spirituality is left. So the Prophet urged us to take advantage of this time. And as I mentioned in my previous khutbahs on the subject of Laylatul Qadr, the Prophet validated those of his companions who experienced Laylatul Qadr in the first 10 days of Ramadan. So the lesson to be learned here, that Laylatul Qadr is not limited to the last 10 nights of Ramadan, and your experience of Laylatul Qadr is a function of your own timing, and it can happen anytime. The key is to be open to feeling Allah reaching out to you, communicating to you and with you, and to feel your closeness and your intimacy with him. I wish to share with you, brothers and sisters, a very, very joyful dream that I had this morning. I dreamt that 3 members of our congregation attained the rank of spiritual perfection. I was so happy in this dream that I actually felt that this was a manifestation of Laylatul Qadr. I was not given the names of these 3 individuals, but I congratulate them anyway. So pray that you may have been one of them. And I congratulate those of you who have achieved this wonderful maqam the rank of spiritual perfection. And I urge you to remember that Allah has declared in verse 56 of Surah 51, Al-Dhariyat, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create jinn kind or mankind except to worship me. So the sweetness that you feel in your soul after praying, which many of us have felt in our Tarawih prayers, in our Fajr prayers, which we have been doing on Zoom this past month, this pleasure is a sign that you feel this pleasure because you are doing what Allah has created you for. A joy that is deeply fulfilling. But this pleasure is not only yours, it is also God's pleasure that you feel in fulfilling your purpose. When you are created for a purpose and you fulfill that purpose, you feel a special pleasure, one that was best expressed in the famous line from the 1980s movie Chariots of Fire, a story of two British athletes who ran in the 1924 Olympic Games. One was a devout Scottish Christian, Eric Liddell, whose parents were missionaries in China. In a scene where Eric's sister critiques him for focusing on his running instead of focusing his efforts on continuing his family's missionary work in spreading Christianity in China, Eric responds with this line, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. This notion of feeling a very heightened and specific pleasure when you do something that you know Allah created you for is what we should all feel and aspire to feel when we worship Allah. So if analogously, if Allah created you pious and you express your piety in your acts of worship, you too will feel God's pleasure by expressing your piety. This is why in earlier khutbas in this month of Ramadan, I've drawn your attention to the joy that you feel when you break your fast after having fasted each day, a joy that includes the anticipation of the joy you will feel on meeting your Lord, according to the Hadith Qudsi, where Allah says that my fasting servant will experience two moments of joy, one when he breaks his fast and the other on the day that he meets me. One of the blessings that we Muslims have is this delight in fulfilling Allah's purpose in us. Many Muslims have told me how much they enjoy fasting. It may sound counterintuitive to say that you enjoy fasting. It is intuitive and it makes sense to say that you enjoy eating, but to say that you enjoy not eating. But the pleasure that many of you find in fasting, in praying, in performing acts of worship are all proofs of what the Prophet has called halawat al-iman, the sweetness of faith. We enjoy going on Hajj and Umrah, a crowded location in a desert location, more than going on a holiday tour to a popular tourist destination. We enjoy giving charity more than we enjoy making money. We enjoy fasting and we enjoy praying. This sweetness of faith is a sweetness that we savor in our soul, a sweetness that is a sign of our connection with Allah and of our intimacy with Him. This is the fruit of our Laylatul Qadr experience, that we feel this enhancement of spiritual sweetness. So don't go looking for Laylatul Qadr on only one specific night and then lose hope if you don't feel anything super special on this 27th of Ramadan. If you have felt an increase in your enjoyment of spiritual sweetness this month, consider yourself as having gotten a taste of Laylatul Qadr. If you have experienced an increase in your piety this month, you have fulfilled the purpose of fasting. And I dare say that you have tasted a little bit of the flavor of Laylatul Qadr. Laylatul Qadr is so much more than we understand, which is why Allah Himself in Surah Al-Qadr asks, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ? And how can you fathom what Laylatul Qadr is? This rhetorical question makes it clear that Laylatul Qadr is far more than we can understand or wrap our minds around. And remember that the spiritual joy that you feel is because you are fulfilling the purpose for which God created you. And the spiritual joy you feel in fasting is related to Allah saying that all the acts of my servant are done for his sake except fasting. Fasting is done for me, and I will personally reward it. So you feel the joy of anticipating Allah's personally rewarding you. And how lucky we are to be able to feel this, brothers and sisters. How fortunate we are in recognizing that our joy in performing acts of worship is related to God's purpose in having created us. Clearly, whatever it is that Allah gave us as a talent or a gift, when we execute that talent, we feel a deep joy of fulfillment. But how many of us recognize or realize that Allah also participates in our feelings of joy? But it is important to be humble about it, and also to be grateful and thankful to Allah for this gift, to be grateful that He enabled us to enjoy every act of worship. Because if we feel pride and arrogance about it, it becomes a spoiler. It spoils our spiritual sincerity, which is exactly what Shaitan wants us to do. So the takeaway from today's khutbah is that the pleasure you feel when you fulfill a divine commandment, like when you fast, is also a case of your feeling Allah's pleasure. And this can be attributed to an experience of Laylatul Qadr. All this explains why it is natural that we should experience pleasure whenever we perform any of our ritual acts of worship. And this also helps remind us that when we do feel this pleasure, we should hold on to it and recognize in it a moment of a shared emotion between us and Allah, a pleasure that both we and Allah are partaking in, and to be grateful to Allah for it. This pleasure we feel about fasting or performing our Tarawih prayers also helps us to begin to understand the Prophet's saying that the three most pleasurable things to him of this life, of this worldly life, were performing salah, the love of a woman, and perfume. Maybe there was a time when you could not grasp the idea that you would enjoy prayer as much as you would enjoy the sweetness of perfume or enjoy the love of a member of the opposite sex. But now, as you have experienced the sweetness of faith from fasting and from praying the Tarawih prayers, I suppose that we can begin to more readily appreciate this hadith of the Prophet and see in it a hint that directs us to tasting the joy of fulfilling our purpose in worshiping Allah. This hadith has always given me a bar, a standard on the degree of pleasure I should strive to attain in performing my prayers, a pleasure that I admit I often do not feel. It also provides me a bar or a metric to help me improve or intensify the pleasure that I feel when I perform my acts of worship. In other words, I should take the degree of pleasure that I feel in performing my prayers as a metric to measure how good my prayers were. This is because the prophetic sunnah lies not only in the mechanics of how he performed his salah. Part of his sunnah is the fact that salah was the most pleasurable thing to him, the act that gave him the greatest joy of any act he performed in his life. So for those of us who wish to follow the prophetic sunnah, have to also follow his sunnah in this respect. Because the extent to which we have adhered to the prophetic sunnah lies not only in how well the mechanics of our salah matches the Prophet's mechanical performance of salah, but also in whether we feel any joy in performing our salah and the degree of that joy. And if the joy that we felt in performing salah was the greatest joy we feel in our lives. Measuring ourselves by such a standard shows us how far or how close we are from the prophetic sunnah, and also gives us a way to reduce this gap between our practice and the prophetic sunnah. But I must admit that the pleasure that I felt from performing my prayers this month, especially in your company every night during the Isha and Tarawih, is something that I'm deeply grateful to you for, because it has made me realize that I can work on closing this gap between how much I enjoy my prayer and how much the Prophet enjoyed his prayer, so that my salah improves and approaches that of the Prophet in its quality. Again, I express to you my deep gratitude to all of you who have been joining me on Zoom in praying our Isha and Tarawih prayers this month, and also to those who have been getting up and praying Fajr together with us on Zoom. Ever since you persuaded me to lead you in Tarawih prayers some years ago, I have found this to be one of my deepest pleasures, and therefore I'm deeply grateful to you all. How many of us feel pleasure when we perform our acts of worship? In my younger days, I don't remember feeling such pleasure and joy in performing my prayers as I do now. At that time, I felt then that my worldly profession was the arena of my fulfillment and most fulfilling work. But as I have aged and gotten older and hopefully wiser, I feel that the tables have gradually been reversed. More and more, I feel that my worship is my actual primary work and arena of fulfillment, and my worldly work is of secondary importance. How many of us, brothers and sisters, think of Allah's joy as He sees us fulfilling our acts of worship? Allah takes pride in those of us who worship Him faithfully, in part because we prove shaitan wrong. Our pleasure in worshiping Allah and His pleasure in our obedience to Him are sources of pain and anger to shaitan, whereas those who obey shaitan and make him happy cause displeasure to Allah. This pleasure that they will experience in the hereafter is the torments of hell. And because Allah's displeasure, we will feel Allah's displeasure if we follow shaitan, we will also feel Allah's pleasure if we obey Allah. Therefore, brothers and sisters, rejoice in the pleasure that you experience when you break your fast. Rejoice in all your experiences of joy in fasting, in praying, in reciting the Quran, and rejoice in that you are in fact approaching the prophetic sunnah in finding your deepest pleasure worshiping God. May you strengthen and deepen this pleasure, and may you rely on it as the primary purpose of your existence and life on earth. At this point, brothers and sisters, I wish to remind you that we will be celebrating our Eid al-Fitr next Wednesday, April 10th, inshallah. We will be performing our Salah, our Salat al-Eid via Zoom, and we'll be doing it between 10 and 10:45 a.m. The Eid Salah has a separate link, so those of you who wish to join us, please make sure you register for it on the email which you should have received either already or within the next day or so. We shall start at 10 a.m. next Wednesday morning with takbir for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then at 10:15, we shall start the Salah al-Eid. After the Salah will be a khutbah, which, like the Jummah khutbah, consists of two parts. The only difference being that in the Jummah, the khutbah comes first and then the Salah. But in the Eid, the Salah is done first and then the khutbah. We should be done, inshallah, by around 10:45 a.m. However, one of the absolutely obligatory requirements to complete our fast of the month of Ramadan is our payment of what is called Zakatul Fitr or Al-Fitrah. The Prophet said in the hadith that the fast of the month of Ramadan is suspended between earth and heaven. It is held in ransom, so to speak, and is not released until the Zakat al-Fitr is paid. So brothers and sisters, please remember to pay Zakat al-Fitr, which can be paid anytime in Ramadan, but no later than just before you perform the Salah of the Eid. After Salah of Eid, it is too late. I therefore recommend that you make it today if you can, so that you do not forget. That way you will have one less thing to think about on the day of Eid. The Zakat al-Fitr is a per person tax. It is paid for yourself and each of your dependents. So if you are a family of a husband, wife, and 3 children, you pay for 5 people. If you have a live-in maid, she's counted as a dependent. So in this case, it means you pay for 6 people. If your elderly parents are dependent on you, whether they are living with you or not, you also have to include them. That means you pay for 8 people in such a case. So all your dependents, whether they're living you or not, you need to pay for them. So if you have a child who's in college, who is dependent on you, but who's living in the dorm away from you, you of course will need to add him as your dependent or her. So in short, you pay for all those who are dependent on you, whether they are living with you or not. The formula that you pay per person, the daily average of what you spend for yourself and your dependents for food and beverage. I generally use this formula for what I pay because I'm a foodie and I tend to insist on a higher quality of food than the average. I prefer long grain basmati rice. I prefer finer cuts of meat. And I also eat out in restaurants several times a month. So my average daily expense for food and drink tends to be higher than average. I believe that this may also be true for many of our Khutba house community, most of whom are generally well off and spend way more than an average daily of $20 per person. Plus food costs have really gone up this past year. But to demonstrate this formula, if your average food expenditure is $20 per day per person, and you have a total of 5 dependents, you pay $100. Having said this, I also encourage you to add to your payment as a general charity, as all of your charitable payments count as a good deed in your book of actions. So I encourage you to add another amount as charity, or at least round off your Zakat al-Fitr payment for the next $100. I encourage you to pay it today after Jum'ah so that you don't have to rush on Eid day. So remember to do 2 things, brothers and sisters, before the Eid. One is to pay Zakat al-Fitr, and the other is to register for the Eid Salah so you get the right link. And remember to do those things before next Wednesday, inshallah. You'll also receive an email which includes the explanation of 2 other things, one called the kafara and the fidya. Kafara is the payment for those who have broken their fast Ramadan without a legitimate excuse, like having, had sex during the day, for example. Essentially, it's a fine. And fidya is the payment for someone who cannot fast due to disease or old age. And for your information, and because Zakat al-Fitr is supposed to be helping poor Muslims eat, we have been contributing this proceeds from Zakat al-Fitr to a couple of programs. One feeding homeless Muslims in Newark, New Jersey, and a portion also to feed the poor in Yemen. Brothers and sisters, may Allah bless you all, and may He accept our acts of worship. Pray to Allah that He may answer our supplication. Udu Allah Ta'ala and yastajib li wa lakum. الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا كما أمر ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له المتعالي عن المشاركة والمشاكلة لسائر البشر ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم عبده ورسوله النبي المعتبر واعلموا أن الله تعالى صلى على نبيه قديما فقال تعالى ولم يزل قائلا عليما وآمرا حكيما تنبيها لكم وتعليما وتشريفا لقدر النبي وتعظيما إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت وسلمت وباركت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. وارض اللهم عن الأربعة الخلفاء السادة الحنفاء المميزين بعده بالرعاية والولاية والاصطفاء ذوي القدر العلي والفخر الجلي ساداتنا وموالينا وأئمتنا أبي بكر الصديق وعمر وعثمان وعلي. وارض اللهم عن السبقين السعيدين السيدنا الشهيدين القمرين النيرين سيد شباب أهل الجنة في الجنة وريحان نبي هذه الأمة الإمام أبي محمد الحسن والإمام أبي عبد الله الحسين وعن أمهما فاطمة الزهراء وعن جدتهما خديجة الكبرى وعن عائشة أم المؤمنين وعن بقية أزواج رسول الله أجمعين وعن التابعين وتابع التابعين وتابعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات يا رب العالمين. اللهم وأيد الإسلام وأعلي وانصر كلمة الحق والإيمان. اللهم اجعل خير زماننا آخرة وخير أعمالنا خواتيمها وخير أيامنا يوم لقائك وارفع مقتك وغضبك عنا ولا تسلط علينا بذنوبنا من لا يخافك فينا ولا يرحمنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أصلح أحوالنا وبلغنا مما يرضيك آمالنا واختم بالصالحات أعمالنا وبالسعادة آجالنا وتوفنا وأنت راض عنا يا رب العالمين. أسأل الله العظيم رب العرش الكريم أن يغفر لي ولكم والمسلمين أجمعين. عباد الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. فاذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم وأقم الصلاة.